Being a magic caster is a popular role, but it's also an extremely troublesome one. Players familiar with Yggdrasil would tell you that it's a profession where you'll end up useless if you don't plan your future carefully. First off, while magic in Yggdrasil can't be made with creation tools, the sheer number of spells is immense, over 3,000 in total. Of course, you can't use all of them. Magic casters are broadly divided into 4 systems. There's the faith-based system, represented by clerics and priests who perform divine miracles, where faith is the crucial stat for casting. Then there's the arcane system, represented by wizards and arcanists, where magical power is key. There's also the spiritual system, represented by talisman users and shrine maidens, which relies on spiritual strength. Lastly, there's a 4th system that depends on other miscellaneous stats. Each class has its own list of learnable spells. A wizard might have a certain set of spells for first-tier magic and another for second-tier, while an arcanist might have some of the same first-tier spells but lack others that the wizard has. This is how players learn new spells. Each time they level up, they can choose 3 new spells from the list corresponding to the class they've chosen. By the time they reach level 100, they will have selected and will be able to use 300 spells. However, these systems are considered separate, and the level at which you can cast spells is calculated independently from your cumulative class levels. This means if you choose your classes poorly, you could reach level 100 but only be able to cast up to 4th-tier faith magic and 6th-tier arcane magic. To put it simply, just because you have 60 levels in wizard and 40 in cleric doesn't mean you can use the highest level, 10th-tier, faith-based spells. And the total number of spells you can learn by the maximum level, level 100, is 300. Ask any magic caster if that's a lot or a little, and they'll tell you without hesitation it's overwhelmingly few. And that's not in comparison to the total number of learnable spells. First, some spells have prerequisites. You can't learn them unless you meet certain conditions, such as having a specific class, completing a particular event, or possessing a certain item. Then there are prerequisite spells, spells you must learn before you can acquire others. It's common to hear stories of players who spent a third of their spell slots on prerequisites, or those who gave up on a desired spell because they couldn't meet the prerequisite requirements. Furthermore, since each class has a different spell list, the problem of what to choose arises. It's very common to find that a spell you want isn't on your list, and it's not unusual for players to deliberately die to reselect their classes. There are also cases where you finally get the spell you want, but it ends up being underwhelming due to your stats. Take the spell Fireball, for example. It primarily uses the magic power stat. A caster with high magic power and a high level will deal more damage, cast it over a longer range, and so on. Now, suppose Fireball appeared on the spell list of a faith-based class. The rate at which faith-based classes gain magic power isn't very high, so what happens when that class uses Fireball? The damage and range would be far inferior to that of an arcane caster. This is the dilemma that magic casters in Yggdrasil face when choosing their spells. Of course, for a magic caster who pursues a single specific purpose, 300 spells would be more than enough. A famous example is the combat-focused magic caster, a common choice for players in DMMRPGs. Their spell selection is specialized in buffs and attacks. Focusing solely on dealing damage to the enemy is a perfectly valid approach. What's expected of a magic caster is the ability to change the course of a battle. If they can easily defeat powerful monsters, there's nothing better. However, the reason Yggdrasil has an overwhelmingly larger number of spells compared to typical DMMRPGs is that unlike those games where magic is only for combat, here it has a wide variety of uses. For example, there are metal detection spells from low to high tier, and even spells to smelt metal. There are spells to see underground and spells to transmute earth into low-grade metals. The variety of teleportation spells is also immense. Long-range teleportation with a chance of error, flawless long-range teleportation, teleportation with flashy but meaningless effects, a spell to swap the locations of 2 individuals, and one to gather party members. There are spells to teleport to the nearest town, and spells that allow for countless short-range teleports within a time limit. And there are many more besides these. Detection spells are just as numerous: sensing nearby enemies, discovering invisible targets, detecting an opponent's spellcasting, locating specific items, counter-detection magic, and conditional detection spells. There are countless spells that, when used cleverly in specific situations, can break a stalemate more effectively than simply casting an attack spell. Therefore, to a mind capable of considering dangerous situations, the 300 learnable spells don't feel like a lot. In fact, it feels like too few. And since spells once chosen can normally be changed, it's not uncommon for players to spend a whole day deciding which spells to learn upon leveling up. It might be easier to understand if I say that the page with the most data on the Yggdrasil strategy wiki is the magic section.
So, what about Momonga? Thanks to a cash shop item, he has an additional 100 spells. Furthermore, by repeatedly engaging in player killing, PK, and completing a special ritual event, he has acquired another 318. In total, he has learned 718 spells. His repertoire is specialized in tactical and necromantic magic rather than simple destructive spells. He chose his classes to match, further strengthening his affinity for that type of magic. As a result, while he might lose to a combat-specialized magic caster in terms of raw damage, he prides himself on having almost no equal when it comes to breaking through difficult situations. Conversely, he was also aware that he was quite lacking in exploration and search-type magic, having learned only the essential ones. Momonga slowly extended a finger toward a straw dummy set up in a corner of the arena. The necromantic spells he had mastered were not very effective against inanimate objects. Simple destructive magic was superior in such cases. He glanced sideways at Aura. A sparkle of curiosity shone in her eyes. Flanking her were two enormous monsters. The creatures, standing 3 meters tall, had an inverted triangular build. Their muscles, which covered a skeleton that seemed to be a fusion of human and dragon, bulged powerfully. Covering those muscles were scales harder than steel. Their faces were reminiscent of a dragon, and they had tails like great trees. Though they had no wings, they closely resembled upright dragons. They were dragonkin, monsters bearing the name kin of dragons. In their upper arms, thicker than a man's torso, they held thick weapons, half their own height and length, that were difficult to distinguish as swords or shields. Aura had sacrificed her personal combat abilities to gain the highest-ranking abilities as a beast tamer. She could boost the combat capabilities of her servants by up to 1.25 times. She had a total of 100 servants. Those two were among them, and they were in charge of cleaning up the arena. Momonga let out a small sigh. To be honest, being watched with such expectant eyes was rather troublesome. The purpose of this was to verify whether his magic would actually activate. The reason he allowed Aura to participate in the magic experiment was to show her his power before the other guardians arrived and teach her the folly of opposing him. He didn't get the feeling she would betray him immediately, but whether she would remain loyal if his magical powers were lost was uncertain, or rather, he couldn't fully trust her. Aura didn't seem to be that kind of person, but to Momonga, she was practically a stranger. True, the guild members had all contributed ideas to her character settings, but if that character now exists as an intelligent being, aspects beyond those settings are bound to emerge. What if loyalty to a weak master wasn't one of those aspects? That would be one thing, but what if her settings dictated that she should overthrow a weak leader? There was no need to be overly suspicious, but only a fool would act with complete trust. Tap the stone bridge before you cross it. For Momonga, in his current situation, this was the natural way of thinking. So, would it have been better to conduct the magic experiment alone to see if it worked? Absolutely not. If his magic failed to activate, he needed someone to casually ask for advice. Otherwise, he might not know if he truly couldn't use magic or if he was just doing it wrong. Aura hadn't learned many spells, but she could still use magic up to the highest tier. If something was wrong, he could ask her. Even if the magic didn't activate, it wouldn't be a problem. That was because Aura believed he was here to test the power of his staff. Since it was already proven that the magic item's power worked, he could come up with any number of excuses. Mamunga searched through the 718 spells he had memorized. What was the most suitable spell for this moment? First, he needed to know about friendly fire, so an area of effect spell. In that case, in Yggdrasil, you cast spells simply by clicking on an icon that appeared. Now that the icon wasn't showing up, he needed another way. He felt he had already grasped a part of how to do it. It was a power buried within himself. Just as when he had blocked the negative touch, he focused his consciousness, as if the icon were floating in the air. And then Mamunga smiled faintly. Kakal. Fireball. A ball of fire swelled at the tip of his outstretched finger and shot forward. It struck the straw dummy without missing its mark. The flames that formed the fireball burst on impact, unleashing the fire stored within. The burgeoning flames licked across the surrounding ground. It was all over in an instant. Nothing remained but the charred remnants of the straw dummy. Ara? Ora cast a puzzled look at Mamunga, who was chuckling to himself. Era. Another straw dummy. Ah, yes, right away. Bring it over. One of the dragonkin set up a new straw dummy. At the same moment, the next spell took effect. Explode. The dummy's upper body blew apart from the inside, sending scraps of straw flying. Straw that had formed its head, now more than half blasted away, hit the body of the nearby dragonkin and fell to the ground. The dragonkin let out a low growl and shot a sharp glare at Mamunga. Now that he could cast magic, it wasn't a particularly frightening opponent. He was confident he could kill a dragonkin in an instant. Still, he probably owed the owner an apology. With that thought, Mamunga turned to Ora.
My apologies. I should have used it from a bit further away. Eh? It's fine. They don't mind being covered in straw. Yes. Despite the spell going off right next to her dragonkin, Ara showed no sign of surprise or worry. She waved her hands dismissively, seemingly more surprised that Mamunga had apologized. Was it because single target spells don't miss their mark, or was it because she trusted him? Or perhaps she just didn't care if the dragonkin died. In any case, he had confirmed his magic worked. It was safe to conclude that he could use all his abilities from Yggdrasil. Next, it was time to use magic to try and contact a GM, though he didn't hold out much hope. Mamunga cast the spell. Message. The first person he tried to contact was a GM. In Yggdrasil, if they were in the game, you would hear a sound like a cell phone ringing. If not, the call would end immediately without a ring. This time, it felt like something in between. It's hard to put into words, but he felt something like a thread extending, searching for something. But without any sign of connecting, the spell's duration ended. Disappointment and the feeling of I knew it were equally strong. Mamunga cast the same spell again. The target wasn't a GM this time. It was the guild members of Ain's-Ul Gown. But, as expected, or perhaps it was only natural, there was no reply from anyone. Suppressing the urge to sigh, Mamunga considered his next move. Contacting Seaboss wasn't a bad idea, but for now, he focused on the staff, drawing out its power. Summon Primal Fire Elemental. Where he pointed the staff, a giant sphere of light appeared, and from its center, a tremendous vortex of fire erupted. The swirling vortex grew at an accelerating rate, swelling to a diameter of 10 meters and a height of 15 meters. The raging crimson inferno whipped up a hot wind around it. In the corner of his eye, he saw the two dragonkin using their massive bodies to shield Ara from the blast. Mamunga's robes flapped violently in the heat wave. The heat was intense enough to cause burns, but it had no effect on Mamunga, who possessed absolute immunity to fire. Eventually, the fiery tornado, having consumed enough of the surrounding air, shimmered with the brilliance of molten iron and took on a humanoid form. A primal fire elemental, a being near the very top of the elemental hierarchy. It was a monster of level 80. Whoa! Ara looked up, her voice filled with awe. Before this top-class elemental, which could never be summoned with normal summoning magic, she wore the expression of a child who had just received the toy they'd always wanted. Want to try fighting it? Eh? After a moment of bewilderment, Ara broke into an innocent, childlike smile. Though for a child's smile, it was a bit, no, quite warped. Are you sure?
I don't mind. It's no problem if it gets destroyed. Momanga shrugged. The creature, summoned by the power of his staff, could be summoned again tomorrow. It wasn't a big deal if it was destroyed. More importantly, are you sure you'll be okay? Brute force types aren't your strong suit, are they? I'll be fine. I'm immune to fire damage, so I think I can manage. Half listening, Aura began to prepare. She was probably already formulating a battle plan in her head. Don't push yourself too hard, okay? Yes. Her reply was full of energy. Her plan seemed to be decided as she ordered the dragonkin at her sides to move away. She likely intended to fight alone. Primal Fire Elemental. The shimmering, burning mass of fire began to move. Defeat Aura, but if she falls, that's the end. Return. The giant of flames formed massive fist-like fireballs and began to approach Aura at the speed of a brush fire. Aura took a whip in each hand, preparing to intercept it. Watching Aura begin her battle out of the corner of his eye, Momanga was lost in thought. What should he do from now on? The problem was that he had gotten a little carried away and used too much magic. He still had plenty of MP left, but since anything could happen, he needed to conserve it. He'd like to recover it if possible, but magic had tiers, ranging from 1 to 10, and then there was what was called the super tier. The MP cost of a spell is determined by its tier. A tier 1 spell cost 1 MP, a tier 10 spell cost 10 MP. For example, a magic caster with 100 MP could cast a tier 1 spell 100 times, but a tier 10 spell only 10 times. Super tier spells had a different calculation, so they were an exception. Using spell enhancements like silent casting, spell boosting, or changing a spell's attribute would consume even more MP. It took 6 hours of real time for MP to fully recover. In other words, if you got carried away and spammed high-tier spells, you'd run out of gas quickly. As a side note, base MP was generally your level multiplied by 10. To this, you added bonuses from stats, specific skills, equipment modifications, and class adjustments. Momanga's current MP was 1980. This was largely due to the effect of the Staff of Ain's-Ul Gown, placing him in the top class of magic casters in Yggdrasil. Knowing that a level 100 player typically had around 1300 MP should give you an idea of how large his pool was. There were no convenient MP recovery potions to restore spent MP. The only way to recover it was through the passage of time. So, does that mean solo hunting for a magic caster was mostly about waiting for MP to recover? Well, that was only half true.
This was because of scrolls, staves, and wands. These items contained stored magic. Scrolls were single-use, while staves and wands could cast spells a set number of times, their charge count. However, the spell's power and duration were fixed. If a level 10 magic caster's defensive spell lasted for 10 minutes, the same spell cast from a scroll would only last for a fixed duration, usually about half the time of a caster at the minimum level required to use it. In this case, maybe 5 minutes. Just as the duration was shorter, the power was also weaker. It wasn't quite half, but the damage was probably around 3/4. There were also items that allowed you to cast spells a certain number of times per real-time day without consuming MP. Momanga summoned Moonwolf and the Primal Fire Elemental were effects from items of that type, and the band on his left arm could similarly cast specific spells multiple times a day. However, these items were extremely expensive and not something one could easily afford. Wands and staves were also quite pricey, and scrolls were mostly low tier. In the end, if you spent your money on those, you wouldn't have enough for other items. Therefore, magic casters tried to manage with their own MP. They saved staves, wands, and scrolls as trump cards. As a result, since time passed even while logged out, the basic strategy for a solo magic caster was to log out when their MP ran out and start again the next day. But right now, he didn't have time. Momanga glanced at the band on his left wrist. The other guardians were scheduled to arrive in about 20 minutes. He needed to investigate as much as he could before then. There was no time to recover MP. What else did he need to check? He had confirmed that magic and items could be activated. The only thing left was his inventory, perhaps. Momanga himself owned a considerable number of scrolls, wands, and staves. By nature, he was the type who found it wasteful to use consumable items. Even in video games, he wouldn't use the best healing items even during the final boss fight. It was less about being cautious and more about being cheap. So where were the items that should have been in his item box in Yggdrasil? Momonga reached out with his bony hand into the empty air. He recalled the motion of opening his item box. His outstretched hand sank into something as if it were sinking into the surface of a lake. From the outside, it looked as if his arm had vanished from the middle down. He then slid it sideways, just like opening a window. Countless staves were neatly lined up. This was it, the Yggdrasil item box. He moved his hand, scrolling through what could be called the item screen. Staves, wands, scrolls, weapons, armor, accessories, gems, consumable items like potions. An enormous number of magical tools. Momonga smiled. It was a smile of relief. He now knew that he could protect himself even if most of the beings in this great tome turned against him. Watching Aura, still locked in a fierce battle, Momonga organized the information he had gathered so far and fell back into his thoughts. First, are the NPCs I've met so far just programmed? No, they are beings no different from conscious humans. It's impossible to express such detailed emotions with human-level programming. I should assume that due to some event, they have become equivalent to humans rather than programs. Next, what is this world? Unknown. Considering that magic exists, it's reasonable to think of it as some kind of game. But combined with the previous question, it's hard to believe it's a game. In that case, a world where magic exists, is it reasonable to consider it another world? How should I conduct myself from now on? I've confirmed that I can use my powers from Yggdrasil. Therefore, based on the data from Yggdrasil, there should be no formidable enemies within the Great Tome of Nazarick. The problem is if there's something beyond the data of Yggdrasil. But if that happens, I'll just have to face it. For now, I have no choice but to act with dignity as a superior, if I have any dignity, that is. What is my future course of action? I will focus on gathering information. I don't know what this world is, but right now I'm just an ignorant traveler. I must gather information cautiously and without letting my guard down. Hopefully, Sebas will bring back some good information. Assuming this is another world, should I strive to return to my original world? That's a question. If you asked me if I have any lingering attachments to my original world, I'd say about a third. If I had friends, I would have tried to go back. If my parents were alive, I would have searched for a way back desperately. But I have none of that. Go to work, come home, sleep. Before, I would log into Yggdrasil after coming home and prepare for when my friends might show up, but that's gone now. Even now, I go a whole day without talking to anyone outside of work. Is a world like that worth returning to? However, if I can go back, it's better to make the effort. The more options, the better. It's entirely possible that the world outside is a hellscape. Now, what to do? Momonga's lonely whisper scattered into the air.